Georges Beuville was born in 1902 in the town of Mestri in the Calvados region of France. As a child, he enjoyed roaming the fields and forests surrounding his home and frequently went hunting with his father when he wasn't occupied with drawing. In his later teens, he studied at the Germain Pilon Art School and followed this with a spell at the School of Decorative Arts in Paris. It's recorded that following graduation, Beuville worked as a painter, sculptor and stage designer, but as is all too often the case, I found not one shred of evidence for any of this activity. The earliest example of his work I did find was this poster for a brand of toothpaste from 1925. And although the rest of the decade remains an almost blank canvas, I did manage to find just a couple of illustrations for a 1929 edition of Molière's 17th century play Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme. But I found considerably more from the following year's publication of Honoré de Balzac's novel Aviation, written originally in 1837. And although Beuville's evocations of time and place were flawlessly authentic, he made no concessions to the styles of that age, but rendered all the images with a combination of brushed ink line and imaginative flat colour palettes, which breathed new and conspicuously modernist life into his visualisation. And every page incorporated scenic and character-based images and text with inventive, visually pleasing layouts. But despite these early examples of distinctive narrative work, he continued to create more posters, which had they not been signed I would never have attributed to him. Details about these atypically styled images are non-existent, and it's a guess on my part, but I suspect he may well have been working for a Parisian ad agency at this time, and been obliged to deviate from his natural stylistic inclinations. In 1939, the Second World War began, and Beuville volunteered for the French Air Force as a convoy pilot for fighter and reconnaissance aircraft. But he somehow also continued to work as an illustrator, producing a series of comic strip formatted sequences gathered under the general title The True Stories of Legendary Heroes. They were a highly entertaining and energetically rendered collection of monochromes published in the children's magazine Lisette. He followed this in 1943 with Les Disparus de Saint-Agile, written by Pierre Very, first published in 1935. But when Beuville took it on as a project, his darkly comedic and aesthetically impressive limited colour illustrations greatly enhanced the appeal of the book, and clearly showed just how expressive and downright entertaining his use of this technique could be. In the same year he published 7 hunting stories, which he also wrote, and this book was published as a limited edition of 900 copies. He used his theme to create a collection of descriptive images ranging from small but telling spot illustrations to more complex full and double-page spreads. In 1944, Beuville was commissioned to illustrate a new edition of Ernest le Rebelle, a humorous novel by Jacques Perret, originally published in 1937. And like the earlier Saint-Agile book, these images continued to exploit his astounding control of line and flat colour. There were numerous engrossing and visually eloquent chapter headings throughout, and other images were imaginatively arranged alongside the relevant text, showing some comically anarchic scenes which brought the outlandish narrative to visual life. Like much of his work to date, this edition was somewhere between an illustrated novel and a picture book for adults, undoubtedly one among many significant achievements of his career. And if all this activity wasn't enough, he also began producing a large volume of 2-colour doodles for the Almanach du Gai Savoir, with text by Colette Vivier, which continued to be published annually up to 1948. In 1946, just a year after the end of the war, the satirical book Treatise on Elegant Life and Physiology of the Toilet by Honoré Balzac was published as a limited edition of 800 copies, featuring a collection of amusing small vignettes by Beuville. The same year saw the publication of his considerably more ambitious and visually compelling edition of the classic adventure story Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. All the images he created for this assignment relied on his deceptively loose and scratchy, but always graceful and expressive line work. And in this instance the tonal colour was also applied with immense consideration and control. Many of the images used what could be considered to be cinematic composition, featuring aerial shots and varying viewpoints to draw the viewer in and oblige them to study the image in detail. I haven't found definitive information about his methods and use of media here, but there was undoubtedly some form of textural application of both line and colour, which might have been pastels or some form of crayon. But whatever he was using, he used it with consummate skill and expression. And although these images were obviously not intended to be realistic, there was manifestly assiduous research conducted into all the settings, props and costumes depicted. In 1948 he returned apparently only briefly to poster work with this French comedy film, a suitably frivolous but isolated example. And in the following year Beuville returned to classic literature with his triumphant visualization of King Pauceau, originally written in 1901 by Pierre Loys. Like Treasure Island, it had already been illustrated by a whole host of others, and although notorious for its sexual themes, Beuville managed to resist graphic evocations of the more overtly libidinous moments described in the text. Although there was minimal and tasteful visual reference to the more erotic moments of the narrative, Beuville created a collection of enchanting scenes using a palette of pale pastel colours, and his by now expected ingenious composition and placing of characters in atmospheric environments. In 1949, Beuville's swashbuckling adventure comic strip Le Monde au Diable first appeared in the Belgian comic Tintin, named in honour of Hergé's phenomenally successful creation. The strip was an object lesson in how to create a visually driven narrative which steered the reader through the events depicted with clarity and persistent visual imagination, very much like a storyboard for an animation or live-action film. The strip proved to be immensely popular with the young readers, and Beuville's work continued to appear in Tintin's pages for the next 12 years. Nose in the Wind, a comic view of the ups and downs of hunting, written by Robert Flamand Hennebeek, was published in 1953, with some humorous gesturally inked monochromes by Beuville used as spot illustrations to visually enhance the text. In 1954, Beuville published his illustration of The Huge Beast by Jacques Perret, the story of a prehistoric animal who is helped in his mission to return to the sea by a teenage boy. This unusual but compelling and ultimately heartwarming tale provided the illustrator with a narrative he could become fully immersed in. And the dark expressionistic gouache paintings he created, using a particularly earthy colour palette, formed a perfect foil for the narrative. And as with many of the books he worked on, it's hard to imagine how anyone could have been better suited to the commission. Under Enchanted Wings was a flight-themed book written by Gérard Josseau, and it featured numerous hatch pen and flat colour images of aircraft in flight, which stylistically harked back to his earlier more graphic technique in their execution. It was also at this time that Beuville was commissioned by Air France to create a series of paintings to be used as posters to promote travel to the various global destinations the airline flew to. And each one avoided any gimmicky or overtly touristy imagery and simply but eloquently evoked the scenery and figures with considerable descriptive prowess and authenticity. Three Turns of the Fox by Paul François was published in 1960, and it provided Beuville with yet more material to exploit his own abiding fascination with the remote rural past. Incredibly grubby evocations of humorous peasants kept this narrative rolling along with considerable entertainment value and, as always, plenty of aesthetic pleasure. The following year's Bernique by Jean-Michel Gulcher was another example of comedic medievally themed fiction, and it was no surprise that Beuville produced many engrossing, humorous, plausibly authentic images to illuminate the exploits of this humble peasant character and those he encountered, all set within well-observed rustic environments. The books The Hunter and the Pointer and The Hunter and the Hound, written by L.Z.R. Blaze, were published in 1961 and 1962 respectively. Both boasted essentially scenic work created with consummate mastery of gouache paint, which although they featured human and animal characters, they were kept very small within the overall compositions, and it was undoubtedly the imposing rural environments which stole the show and invited the viewer to admire them for the longest time. Dates of publication of quite a lot of Beuville's work are erratic and contradictory, and not helped by the multiple reprintings many of them deservedly enjoyed. So my assertion that he began a long-running series of books about the history of various French provinces, starting with Histoire de la Franche-Comté, written by Janine Reeves around this time, is little more than a guess and may well be inaccurate. Like all that followed, his colour illustrations blended light humour with historical accuracy, in a manner guaranteed to entertain the readers, and all were possessed of the identical wit and graphic quality. They constituted a relentlessly witty and visually attractive collection of images, highlighting moments both great and small in the histories of the various regions of France. And Beuville never faltered or turned in a weak performance within this entire body of work. In 1960 he first contributed to the Aviation journal Icarus, and among other illustration commissions for this publication, in the years that followed, he created a large volume, some of which were serious in intent and painted, although unfortunately reproduced in monochrome only, and others which were comic doodle pen and ink drawings to accompany the writing of the greatly admired Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And these were produced around his many other commitments during the decade, including the French Provinces series. Théophile Gautier's swashbuckling adventure novel Le Capitaine Fracasse, originally published in the middle of the 19th century, was given the Beuville treatment in 1963, and it was yet another in what now seemed to be a truly bottomless well of creative visual excellence. As always, costume, character and scene setting were all handled immaculately as a matter of course, and each image was roughly vignetted on the page, adding an even more impressionistic quality to the painted work. The Adventures of Richard Smith, a novel for younger readers by Charles Michaels, was published as a French language edition in 1964, and it prompted a collection of highly entertaining and energetic colour renders from Beuville. In 1965, a series of various seminal mystery and science fiction books were published in France, and different illustrators were assigned to particular authors. Beuville was tasked with the creation of colour illustrations for books by Jules Verne, and although the images were as always faithful to the text, his work added a humanity and even light humour not seen in other visualizations of the writer's groundbreaking speculative fiction. The Sword in the Stone, a children's version very loosely based on the Arthurian legend, written by Terence Hanbury White, was published in French translation in 1965. Only 2 years earlier it had been produced by Disney as a feature-length animation, but it's safe to say it exerted zero influence on Beuville's expressive renditions of the story. The War of the Buttons, a novel written by Louis Pergaud, was first published in 1912, and Beuville's illustrated edition was published in 1966. It describes the conflict between two gangs from rival villages, and using a very earthy palette of deep rich browns and greens, he made great creative use of the rural settings in which the story unfolds. And given the nature of the story, Beuville also created scenes of mayhem taking place between the warring factions with considerable visual energy and dynamic construction. Music Theory and the Songs of France was another 1966 publication, and despite the somewhat off-putting title, it was a 2-volume collection of French traditional songs, which featured illustrations by Beuville created using pen and ink with a textured brown crayon second colour. As with all of what might be considered his period work, he apparently effortlessly conjured up highly plausible evocations of more rural times with expressive figure work and scene setting. The book 85 Stories and Adventures of the Air was a collaboration with his wife Janine, published in 1967, and he took this opportunity to create painted evocations of flight with obvious relish. And despite the general lack of a human element, the images nevertheless managed to engage even those with little to no interest in aeronautical engineering. Notre Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo, now better known as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, was published with illustrations by Beuville in 1970. And unsurprisingly, this was another narrative which lent itself to his energetically rendered approach. Of course, the book was completely devoid of humour and featured human cruelty and pathos, which Beuville compellingly evoked with his dark and frequently menacing images. The same was true of his version of Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, published in the following year. And seemingly effortlessly he conjured up the dark menace and urban deprivation of Victorian London with the same acuity he had used with the previous book's medieval Paris. In 1973, Beuville followed this with Letters from My Windmill by Alphonse Daudet, originally published in 1869. And as far as I can tell, this was his last published work, although many of his earlier books continue to be reprinted. And George Beuville subsequently died in the rural town of Rochefort-en-Yvelines in 1982, when he was 80 years old. In France at least, Beuville's reputation is pretty much assured, and he is rightly seen as a highly creative figure for many contemporary illustrators there. What I've shown here is very much the tip of a creative iceberg, and far from encyclopedic. And as usual, there were many images for which I could not find dates or where they were published. But even if incomplete, I like to think that the video has given a clear and relatively copious indication of the accumulated work of a true giant of 20th century illustration,